Okay, I think we're getting quite a few people coming in now, so I think we'll start the presentation. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Larry Green, and on behalf of my associate here, Darren Compton, we will be presenting this and we will be working on the following sort of process. We're going to be discussing Darren's submission to the Senate inquiry about the DPA. We have one question, and we certainly welcome others to ask questions throughout the presentation. You've got the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen, and we recommend that you use that, or you can use the chat, and we'll be monitoring both of those and answering those questions. So the first part of the presentation is for Darren to talk about the question that was asked, and also to give you a bit of general background about the process, etc. Second half of the presentation will be to use that information and talk how the DPA and staffing and doctor recruitment affects the purchase and sale of medical practices, and I'll be conducting that part. So Darren, if you'd like to start off, and we'll discuss the question that was asked.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen now. So hopefully everybody can see this. So Larry, if you can just let me know. Can you see that okay?
That's fine, thank you.
Thank you. So I thought I'd just give you all a bit of a background. So I run a business called DPA Medical Recruitment. We recruit GPs for medical centres from rural areas, such as Tom Price, all the way down to sort of Sydney Metro. We started in 2018. In that time, we've recruited over 300 general practitioners into every state and territory in Australia, from M1 to M7. Quite interestingly, which is relevant for today's conversation, of these 325 plus GPs, only 52 of them are Australian trained. That's 16% of everything we're doing is Australian trained, which obviously means that the remainder are all highly likely to be bound by the moratorium, subject to what we call Section 19AB of the Health Act, and need to serve out that moratorium. Now, we have consultants based geographically. I'm down here in Thirroul, near Wollongong. We have Amy in Sydney, who covers all of New South Wales with me. Kaz is based in Landsfield, just north of Melbourne Airport. So she covers all of Tasmania, South Australia, and Victoria. We have Andrea Douglas up in Brisbane, covering Northern Territory and Queensland. And Dave Bell is over in WA. So the guys have got a really good knowledge of the system and the process, and can answer after this depending where you're all based. They can go through your specific questions one-to-one. Before we go into the Senate submission, though, I thought I would just take your attention to our blog. Larry, can you see that blog okay? Sure. This is a blog that we update every year. So DPA is the new term for what we all used to know as DWS, Distribution Workforce Shortage, now Distribution Priority Area. And you can go to the DXC Medical webpage, website, sorry, and find this blog, and it will tell you in more detail what Section 19AB is. But essentially, it means that those overseas trained doctors have to work for up to 10 years in a DPA location to serve out their moratorium. The more remote they go or rural they go, they can scale down their moratorium accordingly. Now, please feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A section here, even if it's just the location of where you're currently based. Then we can sort of tailor the questions accordingly. So Section 19AB of the Act, as I say, it covers all overseas trained doctors and foreign graduates. So anyone that hasn't studied here in Australia for their undergraduate degree. And then the department divides up the country using the Health Workforce Locator map. Larry, does that come through okay? So for those of you that haven't seen this, this is the This is the health workforce locator map. So just by clicking here for GPs and here for 2019 for the Monash model, that's probably the most simple process. And then you can just search. I know we had a question from a practice owner in Epping in Victoria. So you can see here, anything marked blue means that you're bound by the moratorium, and the boundary is the Mill Park and Epping DPA. So any doctor working in this area will need a special exemption to work there if they're bound by the moratorium. There are a number of different things. So they can have a DPA replacement provision. So for example, if a doctor had joined your practice in Epping when it was still DPA and has now left the practice, they can essentially hand back that DPA replacement provision to an incoming doctor. There are a lot of caveats. The statutory declaration that the outgoing doctor needs to write has to be very, very clear. The number has to be must have been used in the last 12 months consistently, and the outgoing doctor must promise not to return back to the DPA area for the remainder of their moratorium, which for some doctors might just be 3 or 6 months, for others could be another 6 or even 7 years. So just by moving around the map, you can look at the Tullamarine Broadmeadows DPA borders this. So when searching for your address, it's really important to put the specific practice address, particularly if your centre is likely to be on the cusp. Up here, for example, the Romsey option is one of the closest to Sydney. CAS is based up here in Landsfield, where you can essentially work under the 10-year moratorium. So we've just had a question coming in. So can we give a VR DPR replacement number to a non-VR doctor? That's a really good question. So in short, yes, but it does depend on where you're based. So any doctor needs to meet 2 sections of the Health Act, so section 19AA, which talks about their registration status, and section 19AB, which is the moratorium. So if you can just send me the location where that question relates to, we can give you a bit more information. But yeah, it's so for example, a doctor in Landsfield could use a replacement provision. That would be fine. But they need to meet section 19AA2, and that also relates back to the Modified Monash Model, which you can see on the map here. So that was brought in a couple of years ago in 2019 to essentially incentivise doctors to go more rural. And every state and territory is classified by M 1 to 7. So you can see now here that Landsfield is M 5. You can toggle the map. So you can now see the boundaries of the M map as opposed to the DPA map. Okay, so that's good. So we can see here that the question relates to replacement provisions in Hoppers Crossing. So for Hoppers Crossing M 1, you still need to meet section 19AA, so regardless of the DPA replacement provision. So essentially the doctor could potentially work there if they were a temporary resident general registration doctor. But with the new guidelines coming in from January, or the new rules, it essentially means all doctors that are temporary residents and working towards fellowship must now have completed time on a program that could be PEP, RVTS, so a Section 3J approved pathway, the ACRM independent pathway beforehand. So what we're seeing now is lots of doctors, and I'm just going to use New South Wales because that's where I'm based, lots of doctors in the Central Coast that have come here as temporary residents from overseas. They've stayed a temporary resident. They've accessed A2 rates. They sadly haven't got through their exams. So those doctors all need to move onto PEP. So that's the RACGP's Practice Experience Program. Now, this program essentially requires doctors to work in a DPA area, and it doesn't allow for DPA replacement provisions. So you must have worked in you must be working in a DPA M2 area to be able to use that. Now, the applications for PEP, there's only one more round of PEP coming under the current funding model, and that opens on the 10th of January until February. Those doctors will then be required to sit the PEP EA entrance exam, and then potentially they can start on A1 rates from the 1st of July. the RACGP are yet to clarify what's going to happen. We understand PEP will still exist. It will be significantly more expensive. It currently costs the doctor about $9,000 a year to be on PEP. It doesn't cost the practice anything. The practice doesn't need to supervise them either. But if we're looking at the Hoppers Crossing example here, so I should just type Hoppers Crossing. Okay, so just down in Werribee. So this is under the Wyndham DPA area. So Hoppers Crossing, Caroline Springs, Werribee are good examples where they've been DPA quite recently, only a couple of years ago. So a lot of these practices still can carry a DPA replacement provision. I know Kaz has just placed a doctor on a DPA replacement provision in Werribee, but essentially we're now really looking at vocationally registered doctors only for these metro locations. The health workforce certificate now means that if you wanted to try and attract a temporary resident on A2 rates, you wouldn't get a health workforce certificate anyway. So that doctor wouldn't be able to transfer across and say work in Hoppers Crossing. If they're already there, and just before this call, I had a call from a client in Western Sydney. They've had a doctor fail the AKT and KFP. She's been with them for 2 years in a triple M1 location. They were asking, is there any way we can keep her? She's amazing, she's fully booked. The patients love her, and unfortunately not. So she's stuck as a temporary resident all the time she's in this particular location. Come January, she'll need a job offer. She'll then need to go and apply for a place on PEP. She can stay with this Sydney-based practice all the time. She's got a temporary visa there. But going forward, and for her to become a fellow and get her permanent residency, which are two of the #1 things that doctors are looking to achieve, that's going to be a real focus for her next year, is to get out to PEP. Now, when you're on the PEP program, you cannot sit exams. So if RACGP decides you need to do a minimum of 6 months on PEP, you have to serve that time out first, full time. Once you've done that, then you can put in for your exams. So essentially, if anybody listening today has a doctor in that situation, they probably can expect to lose that doctor for up to 15 months. And that's providing the doctor can get through PEP okay and pass their exams first time. So the other thing I would draw your attention to, here is the Brisbane DPA. So the department reviews this map once a year, or at least that's what we thought, until Brisbane came along and changed everything. So on the 2nd of July this year, Brisbane was still blue, meaning it wasn't an eligible location. And then we had a call from a practice somewhere in this region. It might have been the St Albans practice, just saying, oh, we've just seen with DPA. The department has still yet to answer why they suddenly changed the Brisbane one out of cycle, out of kilter. So this essentially, this practice now has DPA at least until the end of June next year. So they've got a window to recruit a vocationally registered doctor that's still bound by the moratorium. The other aspect to look at here, if we look at St Albans, is this BMP here. That stands for Bonded Medical Place or Bonded Medical Scholar. So these are Australian trained doctors that have had some or part of their degree, some or all of their medical degree costs paid. Now, when they become vocationally registered, they're normally required to do a return of service. So if we basically have a look at, St Albans here, and if we scroll to the bottom, you'll see that yes, it is an eligible location for a bonded medical scholar to return their service, which is really frustrating if you own a practice in Broken Hill, because you would expect that Broken Hill would have a priority on these doctors returning their service, and for rural bonded scholars not to be able to return their service in places like Canberra or the Brisbane DPA. So again, that's what's led us to the Senate inquiry. So I will just change my screen.
Can I just also say, Darren, we do have a question here from Fiona regarding a practice in Brisbane North Side. If you want to perhaps answer that.
Thank you. Yeah, that came into the chat box. Apologies for that, Fiona. So our practice is in Brisbane North Side. When doing a DPA replacement application, how many sessions over the last 12 months are required by a departing doctor? I wish I wish I knew the answer to that. The reality is as many as possible and as consistent as possible. And it will depend on whose desk that lands at the Department of Health. There's sadly no consistency with what we're seeing. It's really important that the statutory declaration does say that the outgoing doctor has left and has closed their provide number and will not be returning to, let's say, North Lakes, the North Lakes DPA area for the duration of their moratorium. If they've just been doing one Saturday a month, that's probably not going to be enough. If they've worked solidly for 6 of those months, then that probably will be enough. I think the other real big point to mention here, and a lot of the corporates have seen this as well, there seems to be an agenda with the Department of Health to knock back all replacement provisions the first time. If there's anything slightly wrong, they're being knocked back. And we're sort of led to believe, they won't comment on this, but the reason is that there's probably highly likely that a lot of people won't know how to appeal, or they just won't appeal. So therefore, those replacement provisions will disappear and there'll be less of them going around. For anyone that wants to talk about appeals, I can talk about that separately, but that's essentially goes through the 19AA, 19AB, and then 19AC is the appeals process. And we're getting the majority of these overturned on appeal. So don't give up. If you do get your first one knocked back, then feel free to give us a call. We offer a completely free service where we can check the wording for you. We can give you advice on the best way of getting that overturned. We can help you write that appeal. It still needs to come from you, but the majority of them are getting put back through on appeal. The ones that do get rejected outright and don't get overturned are if the doctor left more than 12 months ago, they don't get overturned at all. And again, if the doctor has literally just done maybe a couple of sessions in the last 12 months, that in itself will probably get that won't get overturned either. So Larry, if you can just keep an eye on that side of the questions for me, that'd be great.
I will do.
Can you see the Senate submission here?
Yes.
Great. So this is our, hopefully everyone's been sent a copy of this. This is our Senate submission. We emailed all of our clients. Some of you may have received it. So the Senate inquiry happens next year into DPA. They're not just looking at distribution priority areas. The mandate is also to look at GP training reforms, with the RACGP and ACRM taking over GP-led training from 2023. It was meant to be January 2022, but the AMA were very unhappy with the proposals put forward. So clearly there's a lot of concern about how GP training will be led going forward. So this obviously gave everyone a chance to put their submissions in. And over the last 3 weeks, we've been sitting in with our clients on their interviews. So they handpicked, I think about 50 of the 100+ submissions were handpicked to talk to a company called Nous, who are Canberra based. And their job is to put forward a review to the Department of Health, which will then be heard in the Senate around about March, April time next year. We're hoping there'll be full transparency on the report. So as we know more, we'll obviously be communicating that through our company page. So for anyone that wants to keep up to date with this, if you're on LinkedIn, just go to the DXE Medical company page, and that's where we try and share all of this content. So please feel free to follow the page, or just give me a call directly and we can discuss your own specific situation, because it can be quite a complex and lengthy process, particularly as we go out from Metro into M2, M3 locations. Certainly as part of our Senate submission, we've asked the department, so here's an example of the map that we've just been talking about, highlighting the Brisbane DPA. We've asked the department for clarification as to why Canberra, parts of Melbourne and the New South Wales Central Coast are DPA, and yet Vincentia, Narrabri, Grafton, Port Macquarie, Broken Hill are not. And we've demonstrated some recent examples where we've had a client in Albury who's just got their DPA back. We were able to place 7 full-time equivalent doctors with that client in the first 12 months from them getting their DPA status back. Bathurst, again, that was a year before, again, really good example. Ballarat has done incredibly well since getting DPA back. Ulladulla down here on the New South Wales South Coast, Geraldton in WA. So we've essentially asked the department to consider making at least all M4+. At the moment, DPA is automatically given to AMSs, anyone on the HPT program, and anyone in a triple M5, 6 or 7 location. But we've asked the department to consider making at least triple M4 plus DPA, because that would then fall into line with the ACRM specialist independent pathway and the remote vocational training scheme. I won't get sidetracked with MD-RAP now, but again, MD-RAP is a bit of a problem. If you're in a triple M2 to 7 location, but you're not DPA, you cannot get access to the More Doctors for Rural Australia program. So sadly, that really works against some practices. And again, we've asked for a major overhaul of both the supervision requirements of MD-RAP and how DPA is assessed, at least allowing for replacement provisions to be used, would greatly help practices to get more doctors for rural Australia. And just coming down through the submission here, and as I say, we can send copies after this. The RACGP PEP program, that also doesn't allow for DPA replacement provisions at this stage. So places like Townsville have relied on IMG recruitment for a long, long time. They just don't get enough vocationally registered or Australian trained doctors wanting to come to Townsville. So they've really heavily relied on bringing doctors in from overseas, investing huge resources in training those doctors, only to then lose them by the bounce effect when they get their fellowship and they move to Brisbane or another major city. We're asking for practices like that to be able to use the DPA replacement provision to at least be able to replace like for like and get that doctor onto a training program. So, so that kind of has covered a lot of the recruitment side. Larry, are you happy for me to talk just for a few minutes on retention?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. For us, retention starts from the second we speak to a doctor. The second we introduce a doctor to a practice, that's when retention starts. It doesn't start after their probationary period and they've been with the centre for 3 months. And there's so much that can be done in the recruitment process. And we spend a lot of time working with our clients to try and reduce the time from introducing a doctor to then getting a contract offer, helping clients look at their contracts, how comparable they are in the market. There's a lot of talk about restraint of trade and all these things. We sort of work with our clients on getting them to improve their Google reviews. We did a blog a couple of years ago where we talked about the importance of Google reviews, not for your patients, but for your GP recruitment. I mean, if a doctor is looking at 10 different options and they can see one centre's got an average of 2.5 out of 5 on Google, and another one's got 4.5 out of 5 from 100 reviews, and every review is being well responded to a GP with plenty of options, that tells them that that's a really high quality practice with good processes and policies, and definitely one to be on the shortlist to go and visit and to meet with the team. So it's really getting to think about the recruitment and retention together, and not just starting on retention when that doctor comes in, because recruitment is just part of the challenge, and then retaining those doctors is really important. So we've had another question come in, and thank you, about the spousal exemption. So there's 2 other exemptions to talk about here. So you're completely right. So the spousal exemption and the 19AB academic exemption. For the spousal exemption, these are very, very much case by case. The spouse, if they are a medical practitioner, cannot be bound by the moratorium. And it's probably easier to talk one-to-one with practices about this. So for the person who's put this question in, I'm very happy to talk separately about this individual case. But yeah, so the spouse cannot be bound by the moratorium. They can be a medical practitioner. It used to be the case that it was sort of assumed that the spouse must be working within, say, 5 kilometres. The department clarified about 3 months ago that that's actually not the case. And we've recently got a spousal exemption for a doctor that was about 25, the practice was 25 k's from where the spouse was working in Sydney. So again, we can help work with the practices to get the letters together to lodge, and that can essentially provide a spousal exemption for that practitioner. We have a lot of success with the 19AB academic exemption. We've got them recently from Griffith University, University of Queensland, Wollongong. So the practice must be supportive of taking medical students. It's got nothing to do with registrars. And if the doctor you want to recruit is genuinely passionate about taking medical students, then essentially, and I'll use Wollongong as the example, we would approach Wollongong with the doctor. They would apply for an academic position there. There's many different levels. You can do lecturing, or you can literally just take medical students at the medical centre. And providing that the university is accredited with Medicare, so has an accredited medical school, then they will provide a contract to the doctor. That doctor, normally for about 3 years, it tends to be, so it will at least cover 3 years of the doctor's moratorium. We then put that together with a letter of support from the university and a letter of support from the practice. That goes off to Medicare, and it doesn't even go to the Department of Health now, which is an interesting change. So we had the one for Wollongong come through in 2 weeks, which was in about March time this year. So again, you can get an answer pretty quickly. The longer part is actually getting through the university's assessment process, and every uni is slightly different. Some universities like ANU in Canberra have never really had much of an appetite for doing this. Others like University of Wollongong have had a great appetite for doing that and want their medical students getting exposure to general practice early in their medical career, and hopefully then choosing general practice when they sort of come to choose their specialism. So that covers a couple of the exemptions.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Darren. If there are any other questions for Darren, please still put them into the chat or the Q&A section, and we'll certainly answer them at the end of my presentation. So, Darren, if you could close your screen. Lovely, thank you. Okay, so not to say that that was impractical, but for me, it's really what is the effect that the DPA or the non-DPA has on the sale or purchase of a medical clinic, because I'm asked on lots of occasions, you know, the first question, is it DPA, or people still refer to DWS? And if it isn't, then there usually is a bit of silence at the end of the line because it doesn't apply to them in their situation. So the effect is I think both real and imagined. I think there are certainly some issues that are in people's minds more than anything else. But it does show that DPA can play a critical part in the sale of a medical clinic. And I'll look at these questions here. How can you overcome any of these perceived problems? And finally, what else can you do to ensure a smooth sale? Now, I'm not going to be talking about the financials or anything like that in this one. I'm more than happy to do so, as Darren said, outside of this forum, but that's we're going to talk about the issue of medical staff and how it affects the sale of a practice. So let's look at the why. As we've noted here, that there are still a significant number of potential buyers who are yet to complete their moratoria under that section 19AB, and therefore the pool of people who can join a practice or buy a practice and want to work in that practice in a non-DPA area is greatly affected, because most of the people who I'm talking to, who are that international medical graduate, still have time left on their moratorium, and that certainly then affects their ability to A, buy a practice, not so much, but B, to work in that practice during the day, etc. There's been a survey recently done by, in March of this year, by PwC, the Tier 1 accounting firm, and that was done to look at the situation with the private, the primary healthcare networks, and the issue of what is a major concern at that PHN level, and that was that there is a shortage of primary care people at that point. So it's not just affecting my area, which is the sale and purchases, but generally people trying to run medical practices, but also for the PHNs in terms of working with their clients and their constituents. Doctors are permitted to work in non-DPA areas only as locums or under special circumstances, and Darren's mentioned that you can apply, but each case is seen to be taken on its merits. There's any number of reasons why you get knocked back, but there's also reasons why you do get accepted on those circumstances. If you're selling a practice in a DPA, then you do have a greater pool of potential buyers, which really is going back to the first point, that if it's a non-DPA and they're still in their moratorium, then there's a smaller number. But as soon as you do have a DPA area, then you have a greater pool of buyers as well, based on that most of my buyers are international medical graduates. Interesting point, and I found this out very early when I started selling practices, and I was getting, people ringing me or contacting me from, far north Queensland and places I'd never heard of back and beyond in New South Wales, etc., that they were looking to buy practices in Melbourne or Sydney, mainly Melbourne because that's where I am, on the basis that family has grown up and they want to send their kids to university or back to senior secondary schools, etc. And they were coming back to Melbourne and to those large cities, and they were going back into non-DPA areas, those major areas, which means that there's a lot of destabilisation of those practices in those country towns and rural areas. That's an interesting concept that we send them out to these places, but when the moratoria is getting close to an end or is ending, then they're coming back to those major cities and destabilising their existing practices. So you've got to replace them, which again makes it hard. And somebody said to me only fairly recently that he thought that graduates are choosing specialisation rather than general practice. Now, I've got, this is purely an opinion and I don't have anything to back it up. But in the same way that there was some studies done some time ago as to why Australian graduates weren't buying practices, it was on the basis that there was a significant number of people going into specialisation. There was the fact that 60% of graduates were now women, which means that there's going to be less people buying practices from Australian graduate schools. And thirdly, there are cultural and generational differences between people, which means that some people want to work just want to work, don't want to own anything, and that also then eventually has an effect on the pool of doctors in that area. So how do we overcome some of these issues? Making your practice attractive to all buyers is not just physical, but it's that stability. And Darren's mentioned the Google ratings and things like that. This is, again, that if you want to get doctors to stay in practices and to join practices, which then make it more attractive for buyers because there's a stability there, then you've got to make that practice attractive to as many people as you possibly can. And let's not dismiss the issue of that physical practice as well. It's got to be attractive, it's got to be comfortable to work in, etc. And even things like natural light can have an effect on people wanting to buy into practices or work in practices as well. So apply for your exemptions where it's appropriate and where you can. Obviously feasibility, as Darren said, Sometimes you don't understand why, but you can appeal, etc. There's nothing wrong with building the right culture in a practice. This is not just for the medical staff, but the supporting staff, the nurses, the reception, the management, etc. And even working with allied health who attend your clinics, I think this is setting a practice, creating a practice profile which is very strong in doing the right thing, considering the need of the individual patient and the patient body as a whole, and creating something that people will want to work for or work within. One of the things that also I think is often not ignored but not seen to be as important is that all, like doctors are like anybody else in a situation where they want to earn sufficient money to make their lifestyle the one that they want. And I think that you've got to provide the means for which doctors can do that. And a satisfied doctor is one who is earning the money that they think is appropriate. And some doctors will not want to work 45 hours and 50 hours a week. Others will be quite happy to work 30 or so hours, young children, whatever the case may be. And again, female doctors possibly more than male. So you've got to work out how can you assist them to use the system appropriately, to have the support staff, the nursing staff, so that everything can be done to make sure that they can earn their right return. And this is a difficult one because one would appreciate that to incentivise doctors is difficult because of the nature of primary care medicine, etc. But you can give people extra duties and opportunities to earn more, to take on greater responsibilities. And you do this in any organisation. Responsibility, etc., usually means that they do have a better appreciation of the business that they're with, and I don't think doctors are any different than that. But how can you make it easier to sell a practice? Because that's probably going to be for some people. So for owners and principals, the first thing is, and this, as I said, this relates not to the financials, but to you as a doctor and what it means to people who are buying your practice. You've got to be prepared to stay on for 3 years. It doesn't have to be at extensive hours, but it does mean that you are required to work in the practice for the sense of continuity, that the transition is a smooth, and for the staff, the support staff, and for the patients, they see no difference. The familiar faces are still there. But it can be up to 3 years, but you can do it at what hours you want and the days of the week, and take time off if you haven't been able to have holidays, etc., etc. Have valid and up-to-date service agreements with all doctors. Now, I'm just selling a practice at the moment where there are no service agreements in place. And if we tried to put service agreements in front of those doctors originally, then it may very well be that they would not have been satisfied, don't like to be tied down, they like the flexibility. And so that's something to consider. However, once service agreements are in place, then they have to be compliant. They have to make, as Darren said, he would be able to advise you on some of these issues, terms and conditions that are both attractive but also protect the practice as well. So there's, I think, from my point of view, I'd rather sell a practice with valid and up-to-date service agreements than not. Have easily understood and fair and reasonable rosters, sharing the load. I've seen practices where some people seem to be, and maybe they've chosen that, but they seem to be that they're working disproportionate amounts of time. Principals I think, tend to work longer hours than the non-principal doctors, the subcontracted doctors. But I think, from my point of view, it's always nice to see that in a practice where you've got maybe 8 or 9 doctors, that the full-time equivalent number is above 6, which sort of says that everybody seems to be sharing the load rather than only a few doing most of the work. Now, these are some of the more trickier areas. We've always tried to protect the business that you're selling, whether it's a medical centre or not. It's always, the aim is to protect that business during the sale process. So if you're a principal doctor and you're considering selling the practice, then you might talk to your practice manager. Depends on your relationship with that practice manager, particularly if it's a spouse. Obviously you do, but if it's not a spouse and they're just purely an employed person, then you might even not tell them until a contract is in place. Now, excuse me, this often comes back to bite people in the rear end during the sale process, because unfortunately, it always gets out that a practice is for sale. Somebody who knows the practice says something to somebody and gets back. So, but the general rule is, don't tell anybody you're selling until you get a contract in place, because you could lose doctors who gets, a bit wary of somebody else coming in, etc. So with the subcontracted doctors, I think there's, until you tell them that the practice is for sale, which is at that contract point, there's little effect on these people until new service agreements are presented by the purchaser. And as I said, if there was no previous service agreements, suddenly to be confronted with a service agreement which appears in their mind to be extremely demanding and restrictive, then that could be a problem. I've just sold a practice in Frankston in Melbourne, and that was a major issue at the end, where the service agreements presented to the remaining doctors. The principal was fine, he got something he wanted, but the others certainly had some issues, and that made it a little bit difficult. This is something that I've spoken about to other people and mentioned in all manner of businesses, not just medical, but buyers should not, and I've used the vernacular here of scaring the horses, but you don't want to upset people by making major changes in the short term. So as it relates to staff, and calling doctors staff here is a general term, it's better to observe, better to see what's happening, to get an understanding of this particular practice, rather than thinking that you need to go in there and as a new broom, sweeps clean. I would always recommend that slowly make changes rather than making major changes, because that will affect how some people see the nature of the practice in the future. So how the differences between the buyers show itself in the way that this works. So corporate, who are not going to work in their purchases, they're buying them as investments, and corporate here is also a general term. It could be somebody who has 1 or 2 practices up to the massive, 50s and 60s and 100s or whatever they may have these days. But smaller, there are more and more people coming into this who I would classify in the corporate sense, that they're not always doctors, they are investors, they are business people who see medicine, primary medicine, as a terrific way to build a business empire, so to speak. Most of them, and I'll use the term most, will have a more structured approach to HR and general management, and particularly HR. They're the guys that will put service agreements in front of doctors. They will be the ones who will have procedures and systems and policies in place, which means that people have to comply and conform to these. And for some people, it is difficult for them to do if they've been working in a much more easygoing environment. They will value the practice on doctor numbers, and as I said earlier, this is based on a full-time equivalence basis. They will want to know how the doctors are, how stable they've been, how many people have left over a period of time and why that's happened. But it's generally to see how many doctors are on site at any one time. Utilisation of rooms comes into this as well, but this is really, they'll look at this and say if they don't want to buy anything under about 4 or 5 FTE, then you'll need to prove that you have that capacity. We mentioned that principals will need to be aware that they'll have to stay on, but my experience with the corporates, certainly the larger corporates, that this is also tied into the offer that they make. And so principals will be required not only to stay, but to maintain earnings. And there are a number of ways that they can calculate. It could be just purely gross income. It could be net income. It could be net profit. Generally, I think it's on gross earnings rather than anything else. But you do need to be aware that that's the case. Now, if principals are requested to stay on, then that becomes what I usually term the golden handcuff rather than the golden handshake. And others have heard me use that term before. But I think it's a good one to use, because if you think that you're going to sell it and you can start playing golf twice a week or go on cruises and all that sort of stuff, and then you're tied in to maintain the earnings, then that could have a serious effect on the sale and your future enjoyment of working. This was something that I think happened some years ago, that I think it was Primary before it became Helios, was inducing non-principals to stay by paying them bonuses and things like that. Now, I'm not sure if that's still the case. There was a tax issue that the ATO, I think in the end sort of let it slide a bit because it was too hard to get the money back. But these people were not owners, and therefore that was not part of the sale of the business. They were not reaping the rewards of selling the business. They were just being paid to stay on, and that's also something that we need to be aware of. So the non-corporate I would probably classify as being more flexible. They're the people who are what I would call the owner-operators, the owner-occupier type situation. They're the people who are buying a medical practice because they wish to work in it. And of course, this has an effect then on the nature of the practice. And if you're replacing an owner-operator, then that has an effect on how we value the practices and the returns that people get. I always say if you're a non-doctor and you want to buy a practice, then the thing I would do is not buy a practice that has less than 5 or 6 doctors, because you can't make that practice work financially. Also, I find that some doctors who are buying into practices who will become owner-operators, they often delay coming into the practice for 2 reasons. One, that they need to familiarise themselves with the practice. And secondly, because if principals and others are staying on, then they're not going to be able to earn the money that they wish to earn straight away. So they often stay employed in other practices and only work on a part-time basis, if at all, for the first 12 months up, or even longer. So there's a way that you can work with them to perhaps start to, if you're the owner of a practice, to start giving them some work to do, give them sessions that they can become familiar with the practice, quicker fashion, but also can maintain their fees, etc., and their earning capacity. So those that don't know me, this is me. I'm the medical health specialist with Exclusive. These are my contact details, and we can provide also help on a one-to-one basis. We can value practices, and we had a question from Doctor who was in Epping. How do we value your practice? It's a bit hard to do it in a forum like this, but there are two sides to this story. There are the factual information, the financials, which we hope are accurate, complete, and timely, up to date. And then there's what we would call the narrative side, which is what is this practice? How does it do what it does? What's unique about it, etc., etc. And putting those two aspects together, we end up with a proper story that we can convey to the market, but also to explain why we have valued a practice at a certain amount. Obviously, most of my work is done in selling practices, and some of you will know me through talking to me about those practices. And also, on occasion, I'm asked to assist people to buy either specific practices or find practices in a particular area. And I think one of the areas that we're going to be moving more into, because of the corporatisation and increasing corporatisation of primary practices, healthcare practices, is that a lot of practices will now be bought and sold off the market. In other words, they're not advertised, they're just done between the contacts that we know, and we can introduce them to a practice, particularly if the practice is a substantial one. So that's me for the moment. Just checking. Sally Stewart has asked me, am I a registered valuer? Sally, I have as being a member of the AIBB, as you would know, I am a registered business valuer with the AIBB. So I do have some skills, if you like, in being able to value businesses, and including medical centres as well. Okay. There's a question here. As an IMG, if I get a GP job in the DPA area and do my RACGP, then do I need to get permanent residency documents to get registration by APRA, taking in account at his age of 50 or her age of 50? What are the options for PR in my case? Your answer, you were typing an answer, so I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to type an answer. It's a very convoluted answer, so I'd probably encourage this doctor to give me a call separately. Migration advice is very independent, so you'll need to speak to a registered migration agent, someone who really specialises in this. We use someone down here in Sydney who's exceptional. He can provide amazing advice there. In short, no, you don't. If you get a GP job in a DPA area as an IMG, and you're clearly not a fellow, you'll also need to be in a location eligible for a provider number. So temporary residency will automatically meet 19AA, but you're going to need to get onto PEP at some point, or RVTS or Acronym Independent Pathway, so we can talk with you about your options. But no, then when you pass your college exams, you don't need to get permanent residency to get your vocational registration. But it does throw up another point. So when a doctor completes their 10-year moratorium, either by doing 10 years or by, so once they've completed their 10 years, whether it's been scaled down or not, they must at least be a permanent resident or a citizen to complete that. So it isn't just a case of doing your 10 years. You must be a permanent resident or citizen to finally see out or to close off the second aspect of that. But I'm happy to talk about that in more detail and provide further information to the migration agents that we use. We have one lady in Adelaide, a guy in Wollongong, someone in Perth that we use. So yeah, we can provide that advice later.
Thanks, Darren. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions that you might have regarding either of the areas of topic we've had? As I said, the aim today really was to give you some understanding of what the DPA system really means and how you can use it to your advantage or make best use of it, and then how the situation then applies to the buying and selling of practices. As I said, this is an applied area and certainly can affect the overall success of a sale, but more importantly, how quickly you can get through a sale and the price that you really want for it. It's pretty close to time. I think we're pretty well. There's no other questions.
Larry, there's just one thing else I'd like to add, if that's okay?
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
So the only exemption, I can't believe I forgot it, is 6-month locum exemption, which some people may be completely familiar with. Certainly, if you have multiple practices in a triple M1 area, one way that a lot of the corporates particularly will deal with this, they'll find a doctor that's maybe got 12 months or 18 months left on the moratorium, and they'll move them across the 3 centres. Now, although not perfect for continuity of care for the patients, the doctors, obviously, it means they can get back to Melbourne or Sydney or wherever quicker, and they're normally pretty happy to do that, and particularly if it's only for, we have a lot of doctors we place in their last 12 months of moratorium. They'll do 6 months where they are, they'll then maybe go off one other place and then return as soon as that moratorium ticks down. So again, that can be really attractive because we specialise in placing doctors rurally. We have a really good database of candidates that when they're done there and they want to relocate back to the city, they contact us and say, right, well, actually, I'm happy to come back and do a 6-month locum somewhere because it gives me a chance to get to know the practice, gives the practice a chance to get to know me. So it can often be a really good solution for practices and doctors.
Can I also put in a personal recommendation there, because Darren was very helpful in a situation where we sold a practice last year in Bundoora where the purchaser had not finished his moratorium, and Darren was able to provide me with the wording of how we could get a 6-month locum for him. And that worked out extremely well because he came into the practice before it even settled to familiarise himself, and the practice was infinitely better having him there than not. And I think that's a pretty good example that, that you can use that to the advantage of both the buyer and the seller in this case. So thank you, Darren, for the help you gave me in doing that last year. On that note, perhaps thank you all for attending. I hope you did get something out of it, and please contact both Darren and myself if you have any specific questions, and we can handle those privately and in confidence whenever you wish to get in touch with us. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, and have a great afternoon and great holiday season coming up. All the best.